Stravinsky and Ginsberg were the two he talked about the most. Igor Stravinsky, because his brother was super in bed with him, and they were good friends as well. And if I remember correctly, it was either right during the end of college or right thereafter that he was talking with Ginsberg. You're reaching far back into the history books.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. No.
I'm sure you're aware of that.
Yeah. I think I was in high school when I first heard that Ezra Pound's final poem was published here in Buffalo, New York. I don't know why I would have heard this. I wasn't seriously reading Pound then. Maybe I knew Petals on a Wet Black Bough, but I didn't know anything about the Cantos, the long poem containing history that Pound worked on through 5 decades. I didn't have any interest in small press publishing. But I had a teacher, the late, great Jack Kenny, who knew these sorts of things and was prone to dropping bits of information like blazes for me to follow, sometimes years later. The thing is, I had this information as an undergraduate at Canisius College because I remember inquiring about it. Did you know that Ezra Pound's final canto was published first in Buffalo? I would ask anyone who cared to hear me. Some professors were incredulous, while in others the inquiry stirred some murky memory from their own undergraduate years. By then I had read Pound's early Personae poems, much of the Cantos, and the prose book ABC of Reading. I had wrestled with his anti-Semitism, his sometimes slapdash appropriation of other languages and literatures, his shilling for Mussolini. But despite all this, Pound was to poetry what the Colossus of Rhodes must have been to Aegean seafarers 2 millennia ago. A celebration, a culmination, a challenge, pointing a way backward and forward at once. So his connection to this little post-industrial town, situated in the armpit of an inland sea, caught my imagination. I needed to know more. I found confirmation of my obsession in an unlikely place. The free bookshelf, just outside the elevators on the 9th floor of Churchill Tower, a building that housed faculty offices shaped a bit like a double-A battery, and once affectionately called after the Jesuit president who had built it, McGinley's last erection. There, I picked up the retiring Professor Sandra Cookson's New Directions, The Cantos of Ezra Pound, 6th printing, 1977. On the copyright page, under Acknowledgements, I saw it. Part of Canto 113 first appeared in Poetry in 1962, and part first appeared in The New Yorker in 1968. Canto 120 first appeared in Threshold, Belfast, Ireland, and in Anonym, Buffalo, New York, edited by Mark Robison in 1969. I'll admit my heart sank a bit. Was the story a fabrication? Had the Buffalo magazine only reproduced something that had appeared in Belfast 7 years earlier? But if that was the case, why would New Directions, and specifically Pound's publisher James Laughlin, give Anonym privileged place on the copyright page? But at least I had 2 new threads to follow. The University of Galway has digitized all of the issues of Threshold, a wonderful little magazine that takes its name from a poem by William Butler Yeats, and it counted Seamus Heaney, John Montague, and Brian Friel among its editors. Within an hour of scouring, I spotted it. Issue number 17, published in 1962, includes Fragment from Canto 115 by Ezra Pound. In the Cambridge Companion to Ezra Pound, the scholar Richard Taylor asserts that Pound himself authorized this publication, giving a copy to Desmond O'Grady with direction to forward it to Professor Roger McHugh of University College Dublin, who was to be a guest editor of Threshold. It's easy enough to believe that Pound would entrust a fragment, essentially a draft, a work in progress, to an esteemed but still avant-garde Northern Irish publication named in honor of Yeats. After all, exactly 53 years earlier, the younger poet had turned up on William Butler's London doorstep, announcing himself to be the elder's unsolicited assistant. But Threshold presented a contradiction. This was Canto 115. I continued to comb the archive, Canto 120 did not appear.
Scientists are in terror. The European mind stops. Wyndham Lewis taking blindness rather than have his mind stop. Night under wind amid cacophony, the petals are almost still. Mozart, Linnaeus, Sulmona. When one's friends hate each other, how can there be peace in the world? Their asperities diverted me in my green time. A blown husk that is finished, but the light sings eternal, a pale flare over marshes, where the salt hay whispers to tides change. Time, space, neither life nor death is the answer, and of men seeking good, doing evil. In meine Heimat, where the dead walked and the living were made of cardboard.
That was not Canto 115 either. At least, it wasn't the fragment of Canto 115 that appeared in Threshold in 1962. If you're curious, you can see a reproduction on my Substack, along with all the other publications I'll discuss here. No, that was Pound reading a later iteration in Spoleto, Italy, in the summer of 1967, 5 years after the Threshold publication, courtesy of the Penn Sound archive. The poem begins in the same place, and some of the later moments are identical, but much of the poem has changed. By the time I found Threshold and heard this recording of Canto 115, I also had secured a copy of Anonym Quarterly number 4, the one cited in the New Directions publication. Canto 120 does appear, oddly attributed to The Fox, not Ezra Pound, within the pages of the magazine, though the copyright page does correctly credit EP. For now, consider this. Comparing these three publications revealed a movement of the poet's mind. By 1967, Pound had removed from Canto 115 several lines that had appeared in the version printed in Threshold in 1962. 8 of those lines would appear, rearranged, another 2 years later in Anonym as Canto 120. I know you want to hear it, but you'll have to listen to the end for that. First, the questions. How did a fragment from Canto 115 become Canto 120? How did Canto 120 end up in Buffalo? And, I might add, why do I care? Back in 2015 and 2016, another little magazine was slipping uninvited into the tradition of small press publishing in Buffalo. We called it Foundlings. We were inspired by earlier magazines from what we now call the mimeograph revolution. These regularly included the most famous poets of the day alongside students and locals, some of whom would never go on to publish a book. We had seen Robert Creeley, George Butterick, and Milton Kessler appearing in Slow Mountain, a magazine that Max Crinnan's father, Jerry, had edited while a student at Binghamton in the 80s. And I remembered the story of Ezra Pound in Anonym. Had Pound, 84 years old and living in Italy in 1969, perhaps then the most eminent poet alive and famously reluctant to release his late work, responded to an unknown graduate student in Buffalo, New York, and shipped off what would be his final poem to appear in a mimeographed magazine alongside the editor's professors and drinking buddies? Eventually, I realized that I needed to compare notes with other Pound scholars. I started by talking with Joshua Coden and Robert Spoo, based at Princeton.
I'm Joshua Coden. I'm an associate professor of English at Princeton University.
I'm Bob Spoo. I'm also Josh's colleague at Princeton, and I have the Irish Letters chair.
I started reading Pound seriously in graduate school. One of my advisors was a Poundian, Rob von Hallberg, and studied Pound with him. And then I ended up writing a little bit about Pound in my dissertation, which became my first book, especially in relationship to the poet J.H. Prynne. I've always been interested, since I've been interested in poetry, interested in little magazines. And I was very interested in Pound in that way as well. When I was in graduate school, I was the editor of the Chicago Review and kind of became interested in little magazines, both from a scholarly perspective and also from a practical one. So that is maybe a real intense side of my interest in Pound, in addition to being a scholar of the history of 20th century poetry.
I think I started reading Pound when I was maybe a junior in college, because I remember a friend bringing me as a gift a hardbound copy of the Cantos, so that kind of strange Princetonian black and orange cover that I still have. I just read in Pound's Cantos with mystification and pleasure as an undergrad. And when I was here as a graduate student, I got my PhD here. He was not my primary subject, but he fitted into the dissertation topic to some extent. And then after I finished the dissertation, I remained here for a couple of years as a lecturer. I got to know quite very well the son of Ezra Pound, Omar Pound, who lived in Princeton, lived with his spouse in Princeton, moved here about 1980, I think. And I actually lived in their house. Their daughters had left, and I rented a room from them. Got to know Omar very well. Eventually did publish 2 volumes of Pound's letters with Omar. Continued my published on Pound now and again, and then got very interested in the law and copyright, a story about going to law school and all of that. But Pound fitted in very interestingly in my thinking about piracy and copyright. Pound was, although he was a noisy anti-pirate, he was in fact a sotto voce pro-pirate. That always very much interested me. I'm not pirate exactly, but a disseminator. And then, the latest installment is Josh and I were on this panel in Italy this summer that Josh organized on the drafts and fragments and piracy, the Ed Sanders piracy. And I didn't know a lot about it until I started really working with the topic. And then I just got fascinated by it and met Ed Sanders, who was here, asked him a little bit about it. It's one of the, it's one of the really interesting moments of Pound's career.
I want to talk about some of the other characters involved in these episodes because, you mentioned luminous details at the beginning. And I think the luminous details that jump out to me are maybe a little bit different, partly because I'm not really a Pound scholar and partly because I came to this because of a localized interest in Buffalo.
Mhm.
And in reading over accounts of the publications of drafts and fragments and the piracies, and in reading over Laughlin's correspondence around these issues, I haven't really seen anybody connecting the dots, that is, among Niagara Frontier Review, Anonym, and even Ed Sanders' Fuck You Press. And this is, from my view, a very tight cluster of just a few people who are involved. I noticed Laughlin, in talking about the Niagara Frontier Review publication, focused entirely on a guy named Harvey Brown, who was nominally the publisher. And he wrote him a letter, or had his lawyers write him a letter and say, give me $250 for this. And kind of incredibly, Brown wrote back and said, I thought Ezra Pound would be pleased by this publication, which that was great. And indicative of, as you both discussed, this feeling by some at the time that they had some ownership or shared agency or something over these poems. But Harvey Brown was just a graduate student. The poetry editors were Fred Waugh and Charles Olson. And Olson's closeness to Pound suggests to me that it's, if we're asking where did Harvey Brown get these poems, my first, inquiry would be around Olson. But then when you turn to Anonym a few years later, I don't see Laughlin at all make a connection between an Anonym and Niagara Frontier Review. But Josh, as you were describing, the Chicago Review editors leaving and creating their own publication, Anonym is in a lineage that's directly descended from the Niagara Frontier Review. Olson was still around UB and actually just leaving at that point when Anonym started. Creeley was instrumental in starting Anonym. John Wieners was an unofficial advisor to Mark Robison, who edited Anonym. And certainly the spirit of Olson was kind of the animating force around that entire scene. And then the third dot I want to connect here is Fuck You Press. Precede, the publication of poems by Ed Sanders that came out in, I think, 1969. The publisher of that was Harvey Brown, the graduate student from Buffalo who ran Frontier Press, which was the umbrella organization for Niagara Frontier Review. So all of these same people are involved. And the one figure that I continue to come back to is Olson, perhaps because he had the closest correspondence to Pound of any of them. Have you thought about those connections, or does that immediately strike you as pointing in any new direction of inquiry?
I don't know if there exists. I don't think there. I don't think there does, but maybe I'm wrong. A history of poetry and poetics at Buffalo from Olson, or even slightly before Olson, Albert Cook, who I think was instrumental in hiring Olson, to Charles Bernstein and his students. And I've always thought, or I've long thought, that history needs to be written because it's such an important part of 20th century poetry or post-war American poetry. Yeah, I, I guess I don't know whether Olson. I don't know how to think about Buffalo. Whether it's Olson's at the center and everyone else is orbiting around him, or he is just an important planet in a solar system. Um, you know, can't remember what year Creeley arrives at Buffalo. Um, Already, like Olson, I think arrives in '63. Leroy Jones is in Buffalo in the summer of '64. Ed Dorn is at Buffalo the summer of '64. Whether Olson was the one that brought them there. Andrew Crozier from England, I think, is there at the same time. So whether Olson is kind of the mastermind of making Buffalo a kind of a nexus for poetry, or whether Olson is just another example of how the fact that Buffalo was a nexus for poetry is unclear. Maybe Aiden, or have a sense of that. And the librarian, Robert Bortolf, is that the name, right, Bob? Yeah.
Yeah.
The Duncan scholar. When does he arrive? How did all of these connections happen? And just so many students making such interesting things for a long, really from 1963 to 1993. It probably is no more important place except for maybe New York, San Francisco, like a major city.
It turns out there was a precedent, one that largely escaped the attention, or at least the ire, of Pound's publisher James Laughlin at New Directions. See, Anonym was part of a lineage of little magazines in Buffalo, owing their existence, at least in part, to the poets and professors L. Cook and Charles Olson. The first was called Niagara Frontier Review, and the fall 1965, spring 1966 issue includes 2 cantos by Ezra Pound, Cantos 110 and 116. There are wonderful moments in these poems. What panache, paw flap, wave tap, that is gaiety. And came Neptunus, his mind leaping like dolphins. The editor was Harvey Brown, scion of an Ohio shipping fortune, who had been among a large contingent of students and faculty to follow the professor Al Cook from Case Western to the University at Buffalo in the fall of 1964. He immediately took over editorship of the Niagara Frontier Review and reestablished it under Frontier Press, which he funded with his own money. Olson and Fred Waugh served as contributing editors. Taylor, in the Cambridge Companion to Ezra Pound, identifies 3 unauthorized periodical publications of selections from the cantos throughout the 60s. The first was Poetry Magazine, oddly enough. Taylor claims that James Laughlin sent, without Pound's permission, a copy of Canto 113 for their 50th anniversary issue. The other 2 are Niagara Frontier Review and Anonym. Their circumstances, according to Taylor, remain a mystery. We know much more about a longer pamphlet publication that would appear 5 years later. The poet, musician, and activist Ed Sanders came into possession of contraband cantos, specifically cantos 110 to 116, and published them without permission in a mimeographed edition of 300 through his own Fuck You Press in 1967. Before Fuck You, Sanders produced the Peace Eye catalogs, a kind of advertisement for the sale of, quote, manuscripts, holographs, literary relics, tape recordings, drawings, books, magazines, broadsides, tractata, ejaculata, dreck, and other effluvia of the literary divinity. This trade put him in touch with many rare book dealers, leading him eventually to open his own peace-eye bookstore. Nick Sturm, a scholar of the period, thinks that Sanders acquired the Cantos drafts through his peace-eye connections. Joe Brainerd provided the cover art, an image of a nude male torso beneath gemstones. The title page named the place of publication as a secret location in the Lower East Side, New York City, USA.
You notice something that in hindsight is obvious, but never would have occurred to me, was the fact that all the poems in the Fuck You edition of the Cantos 110 to 116 had previously been published. Right. Yeah. Which is, again, a small thing, but a totally major thing that, Sanders wasn't necessarily, a pirate or even a publisher. He was a collator. Wouldn't be surprised if he didn't know about them. Like, he was a bookseller after all. Yeah. He put together these very elaborate and very impressive book, catalogs of used and rare books to sell. So he was a bibliographer in his own way at the time, and had a kind of international networks of correspondence. So
what we knew he thought was that Dorothy Pound, he blamed her actually for what he thought was refusing to allow the entire collection that he'd got his hands on through a chain of folks. He blamed her for holding back the collected poem, and he was wrong actually. But when he was in Princeton in May, this past May, I asked him about this. He still believes that Dorothy. I didn't contradict him. I wanted to hear him rather than but he still believes that Dorothy was somehow touching the poem and was her own kind of monopolist, but private monopolist, and that he was breaking this logjam.
This caused an uproar among Pound's friends and fans, and Taylor quotes extensively from letters between Laughlin and associates, referring to, quote, the disgusting Ed Sanders mimeographed effort and that miserable Sanders piracy.
He was, as I say, he presented himself as an enemy of piracy, as early as the Samuel Roth piracies of Ulysses, but a part of him was very Rothian. There's a kind of twinness with Roth in certain ways, both in his love for modernism and his attitudes towards dissemination.
This prompted Pound and Laughlin to expedite the official publication of drafts and fragments of Cantos 110 to 117 with the explicit aim of preventing further piracy. But while Laughlin's letters overflow with animosity for Sanders, Olson escapes almost unnoticed. In fact, when Laughlin does notice Niagara Frontier Review, he focuses on Olson's graduate student, Harvey Brown. In 1967, Pound sent Laughlin corrections on a draft of Canto 116 for inclusion in the National Arts Foundation's American Literary Anthology. In his reply, dated 3 August 1967, Laughlin relates to Pound the story of Niagara, which he attributes to, quote, Harvey Brown, who teaches at one of the colleges out there near Buffalo. Laughlin goes on, he evidently got his text either from Hugh Kenner or from Donald Hall by the Underground Railroad. Then, without letting you or anybody else know, he just started in to print it. Fortunately, a friend of mine who knows him heard of it and tipped me off, and I immediately got Herbert Gleason, Hill & Barlow to go to work on him. That's the law firm that represented Pound in these matters. Gleason, with his usual proficiency, extracted a payment of $250, which went into your account the year before last. He also saw to it that he put a proper copyright line in, which this young man had never thought of doing. Harvey Brown's apology for his piracy was pretty lame. He said that he thought that you would be pleased, and apparently it never had occurred to him that you might like to be paid. Well, I like to think he has learned his lesson now, as Gleason really scared the wits out of him. Later that month, Ava Hess supplied Laughlin with a new theory of the provenance of the Niagara Cantos and their inconsistency with other drafts. I am sure that it was neither Ezra nor Olga, she wrote, but a third person who had received a carbon copy of Ezra's manuscript and gave the review a version which they had retyped, thus introducing errors. These are interesting theories, but it is highly improbable that Donald Hall, of all people, would have supplied an unpublished Pound draft to a magazine associated with Olson, Waugh, Creeley, and the New American Poetry. In the anthology wars of the 1950s and 60s, Hall co-edited New Poets of England and America, this was in 1957, which notably excluded Olson. The two New Englanders were sometimes foils, as one can see in correspondence among the organizers of the Vancouver Poetry Conference in 1963. Kenner didn't know anything about Olson either. Years later, after both the poets had died, Olson's student Al Glover presented Kenner with a line Pound wrote from St. Elizabeth's Hospital in 1946. Quote, "Olson saved my life." And the great scholar thought the patient was referring to his doctor. It's more likely that Olson got the drafts from Pound himself. Pound obviously thought highly of Olson, and though Olson thought Pound's politics precisely 200 years out of date, he repeatedly sought out the older poet, from St. Elizabeth's in 1946 to Spoleto in 65. Remember, this is just a few months before the publication of 2 Cantos in Niagara. However he got them, I believe Olson published these drafts without Pound's permission, and I believe he admitted it. This issue of Niagara Frontier Review doesn't end with Pound. The last contribution is an untitled fragment, only 3 lines, by Olson, which doesn't appear in the table of contents. Again, this comes immediately after the poems by Pound. Turn now and rise. Wrest the matter into your own hands and nature's laws. This might as well be a sworn confession. Olson had wrested the matter into his own hands, from there entrusting Pound's poems and the future publication of the remaining cantos to nature. Olson left Buffalo in 1965, and neither Niagara Frontier Review nor the Fuck You publication contained what would become Canto 120. How, then, do we get to Anonym? Though the Niagara Frontier Review would only publish 3 issues, Frontier Press would continue to publish 25 books and pamphlets, championing what would be called the New American Poetry, while also publishing the likes of Pound, Williams, and H.D., sometimes without permission. Interestingly, Harvey Brown published Ed Sanders' book Peace Eye in 1965, the same year that the Niagara Frontier Review would publish Pound without permission, and the same year that Brown would begin to pay Olson, personally, to be a remote consultant to Frontier Press, so generously that Olson was able to permanently retire to his childhood home in Gloucester, Massachusetts, while maintaining ties to the university and the Niagara Frontier. I know this is starting to sound like red strings on a pushpin map, but this is important. Brown and Sanders both were devoted to Olson. Olson seems to have been the first person to publish unauthorized cantos in 65, and so we have to assume that the act at least emboldened Sanders to put out his Fuck You edition in 67. You might call Charles Olson and Harvey Brown their unindicted co-conspirators. Within a few months of the Fuck You Press publication, another alleged canto appeared tacked to the wall of Sanders' Peace Eye bookshop in Thompson Square, New York. Richard Stafford described it in a letter to Frederick Martin at New Directions, dated 20 November 1968. Stafford related that Sanders told him it was the last canto and was brought back, this would be brought back from Venice, by Allen Ginsberg. Laughlin referenced this bulletin board publication in a letter to Eva Hess, dated 18 December 1968. I have shown them to Ginsberg, and he denies all knowledge of them, and I believe him. I wonder if Sanders got a hold of them or if he invented them. Hess immediately identified the 8 lines of the ostensible 120 as identical to lines 23, 16, 17, 18, 24, and 25 from the first discarded version, these are Hess's words, of Canto 115 as it appeared in Threshold, Belfast, spring 1962. Her opinion on the authenticity of the arrangement was adamant. A.G., this is Allen Ginsberg, obviously could not have brought the lines back from Venice, nor could there ever be a Canto 120. I am convinced Canto 116 is definitely the end. This might have been the end of Canto 120, but just as the dubious poem appeared on Ed Sanders' bulletin board, graduate student Mark Robison appeared in Buffalo. Within a year, he would publish Canto 120 and Anonym 4, forever changing the trajectory of Pound's bibliography and maybe even his legacy.
I don't quite know how to connect that fact, which I agree is fascinating, with what it reveals about the cantos themselves, about a poem that, at one hand, is so idiosyncratic and the product of a single mind that no one else could have written the cantos, but also a poem that is so participatory and such collage work and involves so many different other voices. It both seems inappropriate and appropriate that readers would have, or Pound experts would have, the final say in how it concludes. And Bob's comments about Laughlin's sense of letting the last part of the cantos out piecemeal. Like, I imagine, and I don't know this for a fact at all. Maybe one of you do, but I can understand how he imagined a posthumous final volume of the cantos. That Throne would be the end until Pound passed away, and then scholars would put together the final volume based on previously published drafts. Like, that would be a clean way to bring the book together. I'm always surprised when poets publish collected poems very, very late in life. And there are many different examples in my head right now. And partly, I think it's often to do with the publisher giving a gift to the poet. The poet wants to see their collected poems. Stevens certainly did. He wanted to see this brick of a book, representing his whole life in front of him. But from a scholarly point of view, it's a kind of a paradoxical endeavor. On one hand, you do want the poet's participation and approval to have an authorized collected poems, but if you have the poet's authorized approval, it probably won't be a collected poems, because they'll be poems they write after its publication.
I mean, drafts and fragments, no matter how you look at it, is a kind of forced speech.
Yeah.
Pound really never sort of authorizes it at a certain point, but it's after so much editorial water has flowed under the bridge that he's kind of okay, go ahead. There's never a moment where Pound is fully participatory in this, and so who's the pirate? Yeah, I mean, I think piracy, of the Ed Sanders type sort of merges into the piracy of the Laughlin type. That is, there's some publishing here without Pound's full participation and probably full awareness. Um, and it's interesting the kinds of different piracy that can happen. So there's the piracy where somebody publishes a work of yours that you have not authorized them to publish. And then there's Canto 120, which may be a sort of pirate collage. That is it may have been assembled by somebody else. Laughlin thought maybe Martinelli. Some people think maybe Ed Sanders, maybe Pound. I don't know. It sort of sounds Poundy. A lot of these people, again, I come back to this theme of people wanting to make Pound speak at this point. They want him to speak. They want him to speak in a certain way. Again, the ideal is this kind of paradisal acknowledgement of error that is so important to so many of these figures. So not only do they want to let the wind speak, they want to make the wind speak.
Though Laughlin had heard of the tacked-up poem in Sanders' bookshop in 1968, he might have wished to forget about it. He professed never to have heard of Canto 120 in October 1970, when Andreas Brown of Gotham Book Mart requested to print a broadside of the poem, citing a recent publication in Anonym. Laughlin requested a copy, which Brown sent within the week. On high alert for piracy after the Niagara Frontier Review and Fuck You publications, Laughlin wrote to Robison on 12 October 1970. I am writing in my capacity as agent for Dorothy Pound, committee for Ezra Pound, who, under the jurisdiction of the court in Washington, controls the Pound literary properties and copyrights in this country. I have recently been shown a copy of number 4 of your very fine magazine, Anonym, and I wanted to get from you the background on how the little fragment, which is printed as Canto 120, came into your hands. And why is the author listed as the Fox? Did Ezra himself send you this material, or did it come to you through a third party? I was glad at least to see that you had taken out a special copyright in his name for the piece. Did you register this in Washington? Robison did not respond. Exactly a month later, Laughlin tried again, this time addressing his letter to the University at Buffalo English Department. Robison's eventual response is lost, but Laughlin cited his correspondence in a letter to Dorothy Pound dated 26 January 1971. That chap Robison, who printed the so-called Canto 120 in his little magazine, Anonym, finally did answer, and he claims that he received the canto directly from Ezra. That's quite possible. Ezra does lots of things without letting me know. He loves his little mysteries. In any case, Robison did print a good copyright line in the issue, and he has indicated that when he gets back from a trip to Guatemala, he will see about registration, and if he doesn't, I will. The Laughlin-Robison correspondence ends here. Mark Robison passed away in 2019, but in the summer of 2025, after years of searching, I made contact with his son Tyler, finding his cell phone number in his father's online obituary. We went straight to the place where my inquiry had began, Anonym number 4 and Canto 120. I'll tell you, I was so excited to find you. I've been looking into this since, maybe 2016 or possibly even earlier. I recently found your father's name in the Allen Ginsberg papers in Stanford. I wasn't there myself, but when I searched using his full name, that came up. So,
yeah, he was decently good. Not friends, I don't think, but like colleagues type stuff with Allen.
Yeah.
Yeah, they made a book together that he was really proud of called Improvised Poetics, which I still have a bunch of copies of.
Oh, cool.
It was too bad you didn't find me, 5-6 years ago, because I still had a large amount of who knows what from back in the day.
I'd love to, honestly, to know more about improvised poetics, but just to tell you why I'm reaching out, I was initially interested in Anonym and specifically issue number 4, where Ezra Pound's Canto 120 appears. And that's partly because the world of Ezra Pound scholarship doesn't seem to really know that happened. It's not included in the timeline at the Cantos Project, which is a website. Very few people know about it. So I just felt I had to track this down. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember him talking about Anonym. I went a different direction in my life instead of the liberal arts direction. So I wasn't quite as involved as maybe he wished I was. I wasn't super excited about it all.
Mm-hmm.
But unfortunately, everybody that I know of that he was involved with back then has also passed on, except for maybe there might be one couple I know who at least knew of him right after college.
Okay.
And then they might be able to remember some things, so they were good friends with him in that era of his life.
Yeah.
So yeah, you're tracking down this volume, is that the right word? Number 4.
Yeah.
Because you're looking for this thing. You're trying to find that? You've heard about it?
I actually have the copies.
Okay.
And when I first heard about it, of course, I didn't have copies. I think it was maybe even a high school English teacher remarked to me in an offhand way that the last canto of Ezra Pound, the last poem he ever published, was published in a little magazine in Buffalo. And at the time, that didn't even mean that much to me because I, was just a high school student. But he must have heard it from the lore of stuff passed down from people in the UB English department at the time. And then later on in college, I picked up a full edition of the Cantos. And by then I was interested in Pound and interested in all the work that was coming out of UB in the 60s and 70s. And I saw, sure enough, on the copyright page, it says Canto number 120, first published in this magazine in Belfast called Threshold, and then an Anonym in Buffalo, edited by Mark K. Robison in 1969. And I thought, oh my God, it's true. And then I went looking for this and I couldn't find any other explanation of how that happened. And And then finally, I did track down copies of the magazine, just through the internet. And I was able to see it, but it's still a mystery to me how that came to pass, because if you look at what your father was publishing in Anonym at the time, it's mostly other people who would have been in Buffalo, like undergraduates, graduate students, professors.
So how did that come from further away?
Exactly. And, it's one thing for Ginsberg, who was friends with your father and who, was a great fan of Buffalo, or Robert Creeley, who was teaching there. Like, that makes sense. But Ezra Pound, only 3 years before he died, that's harder to understand.
Got it. Man, it's too bad my dad's not around. I can just hear the excitement that he would have.
Yeah.
If somebody looking into something like this.
I have issues 1 through 4, and the rest of them are sort of standard fare for publications at that time. They're solicited from the professors and graduate students and friends, and Ginsberg and Wiener's pull in people from further afield. The Canto 120 publication is so bizarre because it's the only one where he takes out an independent copyright on the poem and puts it on the copyright page. These are all of the contributions are original publications. Why would he just copyright?
Who does that? Who puts the copyright on the page?
Mark Robison, the editor of Anonym, he took out a copyright under Ezra Pound's actual name for Canto 120 and put it on the copyright page of Anonym 4. So the attribution of the Fox is a bit of a wink, but he's not actually obscuring the author. It's on the copyright page. And my question would be, why would he take out a copyright for that poem?
Well, he didn't take out any copyright. He just put a copyright notice on it, right? And taking out is something else. But I would say that actually suggests he might have gotten Pound's permission, because going way back into the teens and 20s, Pound had learned from John Quinn that when a work by an author was published in a periodical in the United States, there could be particular copyright problems that have to do with the copyright notice from a magazine versus the copyright in the individual contributor, and Quinn strongly urged, and actually practices with Yeats and some others, that when you publish in a magazine in the United States, make sure that there's a copyright notice in your name on that page. And Pound did this, and you can see it in some of his poetry of that period. He asks that a separate copyright notice be put on the page in his name as opposed to the periodical. That to me smacks of Pound himself.
New Directions cites Threshold and Anonym for the original publication of Canto 120, seeming to confer equal legitimacy. But Pound scholars have concluded the former was authorized and the latter was not. William Cookson, editor of the magazine Agenda, where Pound had authorized the publication of some late cantos, wrote to Laughlin on June 13, 1973, claiming to possess a letter from EP himself saying no permission had been given to Anonym. In 2025, Tyler Robison comes to the same conclusion. It's not necessarily safe to assume that it was an authorized publication, because there was quite famously a publication in 1967 by a guy named Ed Sanders, who had come into possession of some drafts of Pound's, and he just went ahead and mimeographed 300 copies and put it out. And the press was called Fuck You Press, like kind of funny stuff. So that happened 2 years before the poem that was in your father's magazine. So I wondered, is this another kind of like guerrilla publishing thing, or did he actually get permission? Either one is totally plausible.
And either one is totally plausible, knowing who my father is too. He was the kind of guy who didn't really like to be told what was or wasn't okay.
Mm-hmm.
And he would make that decision for everybody and then try and push everyone to agree with him. And if they did, he would just do it anyway. That's kind of how he experienced the world.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Which made him a really powerful figure in places, but also a figure that broke the rules here and there. And some people didn't like and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I wouldn't be surprised if he was right on the edge, in the gray zone of what is okay or was permission he had.
Yeah.
Because he thought that it would have made his thing more better and more well-known and such. Because I could see how that would be a potential angle of, man, if I get this guy's thing in my magazine, the likelihood of more people picking it up is higher.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So I could see how he would use that as rationalization.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, like he's not the sort of man where I'd be like, no, he'd never do something like that. He would definitely do something like that.
Reading over decades of debate over the authenticity of Canto 120, evidence of wishful thinking is everywhere. Some, like Laughlin, liked the way that Canto 120 concluded the project and sifted for evidence that Pound had arranged the lines, whether or not he authorized their publications. Others, like Hess in 1970, implied they might not even have been an original Pound creation, but a collage by Sanders. Hess, by the way, completely changed her mind on this point. Others, like Rakowitz, Pound's daughter, fell somewhere in the middle, fancying the lines but refusing their position at the end of the project. Perhaps the most interesting theory has to do with the anonym attribution, the fox. This led Laughlin to look to Sherry Martinelli, a poet and painter who had spent significant time with Pound when he was resident at St. Elizabeth's Hospital outside of Washington, D.C., and later became a fixture of the beat community in San Francisco in the 50s. She appears in Pound's rock drill cantos, and many knew that she called him by the pet name, the Fox. Pound was extremely fond of Martinelli. Besides memorializing her in his cantos, he wrote an introduction to a publication of her paintings. But by the late 1960s, she was living in California and definitely outside the circle of Pound's publishers and closest companions, who thought she was a little bit odd. Still, Laughlin and Hess at least took the Fox attribution seriously. While Robison's complete response to Laughlin is lost, the publisher quoted excerpts in a letter to Hess on 5 January 1971. I finally did hear from Mark K. Robison, the editor of Anonym in Buffalo, and he says, quote, as for the little Canto 120 which appeared in that issue, it was from the Fox himself. He then adds his own animal name, which he gave to himself so long ago, but had never been published as such, as far as I know. The wording of these paragraphs leads me to believe that there has been some correspondence directly between Buffalo and Rapallo, perhaps encouraged by Creeley. His letter, his explanation, sounds quite authentic, so I think we really must believe that Ezra intended the fragment to be labeled Canto 120. Hess agreed. She replied on 11 January 1971. The attribution of the poem to the Fox had me convinced right from the start that EP must be personally behind the matter, even though he apparently refuses to admit it. Hess here is perhaps forgetting that she had adamantly denied the authenticity of the canto but 2 years before. Anyway, she goes on. Also, the few lines which make up the little canto do indeed provide a very good ending to the cantos as a whole. So don't you feel that the most likely explanation is that Robison simply got together with EP during his last visit to the U.S.? Since the name The Fox only makes sense in connection with Sherry Martinelli, Robison presumably conveyed greetings from her to Ezra, so that his signing the canto under that name was intended as a friendly gesture to her. It is not hard to imagine why he now finds it more convenient to repudiate the thing than explain it. For our part, I think we can now quite safely accept Canto 120 as authentic, and perhaps we should also envisage the possibility that Cantos 118 and 119 will remain as blank as 72 and 73. I love Hess's explanation, but I don't believe it. Mark Robison, a graduate student, only entered the circles of Robert Creeley, John Wieners, and Allen Ginsberg in 1967, upon his arrival at the University at Buffalo. Although Pound did visit the U.S. in the mid-60s, it's highly unlikely that he would have crossed paths with the young Robison, who, according to Hess's theory, would have had to meet the California-based Martinelli first, then meet Pound to convey the well wishes that would unlock the gift of Canto 120. He then would have had to sit on the canto for nearly 2 years before publishing it in the 4th issue of his magazine. If he had received the canto from Pound, it would have had to have been earlier, and everything we know about Robison from his son Tyler suggests he would have published such a treasure in his 1st issue, not the 4th. Still, I find the idea of transmission from Pound just as compelling as Hess and Laughlin did in 1971. Ginsberg might have introduced Robison to Martinelli, and Creeley or Olson might have facilitated correspondence with Pound. The quibbles over whether Pound intended to end his project here peter out. He wrote the lines as early as 1962. He removed the lines from Canto 115 by 1965, and abundant evidence suggests that between 1967 and 1969, he reshaped them into what we now call Canto 120. The thing is, while Pound considered cantos after 109 as drafts and fragments, after his death, his publisher James Laughlin liked Canto 120 so much that he reproduced it in an obituary notice in the New York Times Book Review and added it to the 1972 third and revised edition of the Cantos of Ezra Pound. Critics quickly recognized the power of the short poem.
It's collected together in a way that makes for a very nice attempted closure. There's the apology everybody was looking for. There's the humility everybody was hoping for. Humility equaling a kind of paradise. Oddly, I guess sort of a Christian paradise, isn't it? That Pound himself wouldn't really have recognized that much. It's a paradise you enter, or the poem enters, after there's been a poet's acknowledgement of error and an apology and a confession and a kind of an absolution from the Poundian world.
In its concision, its mystical affirmation, it seems to step out of the dialectic of the half-century project and into a site of transcendent, even paradisical wisdom. In other words, its posthumous positioning as the capstone to the Cantos forced a reconsideration of the entire project. Okay, so the Anonym publication may have been authoritative but not authorized. If that is the case, I still come back to my original question. How did Robison get the manuscript? My meandering may not have produced an answer to this question, but by the time I returned to where I'd begun, I did have a few new leads. Fred Waugh left UB in 1967, so didn't have first-hand knowledge of the Anonym publication. But he told me that Basil Bunting had been hanging around UB in the summer in those years and might have been a point of connection to Pound. John Wieners, advisor to Mark Robison and Anonym Quarterly, and a friend to Ed Sanders in New York, met Pound at the Spoleto Festival in Italy in 1965. Thanks again to Nick Sturm for this tidbit. He may even have been present at the recording of Pound reading the fragment from Canto 115 that we heard earlier. Robert Creeley, of course, had begun corresponding with Pound in the later 40s. In his essay, A Note on Ezra Pound, he wrote, "For my generation, the fact of Ezra Pound and his work is inescapable, no matter what the particular reaction may be. But it should be equally remembered that during the 40s, that time in which we came of age, Pound's situation was, in all senses, most depressed. To the young of that period, he was often simply a traitor, an anti-Semite, an obscurantist, a money crank. And such courses in universities and colleges as dealt with modern poetry frequently avoided all mention of the cantos. It is hard to see in one sense how we were not frightened away from Pound. There was so much to persuade us of his difficulties and of those he would surely involve us with. But who else could responsibly teach us that nothing matters but the quality of the affection, that only emotion endures? The work we were otherwise given was, on the one hand, Auden, wherein a socially based use of irony became the uselessly exact rigor of repetitive verse patterns, or perhaps Stevens, whose mind one respected and the questions it realized, but again whose use of poetry had fallen to the questionable fact of a device. Pound, on the other hand, brought us immediately to the context of how to write. It was impossible to avoid the insistence he put on precisely how the line goes, how the word is, in its context, what has been done in the practice of verse, and what now seems possible to do. Creeley might have encouraged the publication of Canto 120, but there's no evidence that he had access to the manuscript. What about Ed Sanders and Joe Brainerd, the renegade publisher and artist behind Fuck You Press? Brainerd was a known quantity in Buffalo. The University at Buffalo Art Galleries put on the show Joe Brainerd, People of the World, Relax, in 2007, but I'm not aware of much activity around the time of the 1967 Fuck You publication. Ed Sanders has visited more frequently, a favorite guest at UB, Just Buffalo, and Birchfield Penny events from the 60s through to the present. He was an acolyte of Olson and chose to publish with Harvey Brown. His work and Anonym are part of the same fabric, but to date I haven't been able to get through to him. And then there was Allen Ginsberg, whose friendship with Olson, Creeley, Robison, and others made him a frequent contributor to the region's journals and a regular guest at readings and residencies hosted by the Just Buffalo Literary Center and Art Park, among others. Ginsberg might have been Pound's greatest champion, certainly in that generation. He called him the first poet of our accessible time to reclaim poetry as sound, and he hailed the Cantos as the first articulate record or graph of mind and emotions continuous over 50 years. Surely these beliefs had an effect on the younger Mark Robison. But did Ezra Pound ever visit Buffalo and perhaps leave a few fragments behind? It seems unlikely, though perhaps a near miss. Ginsberg wrote in his journal on the 22nd of October 1967 about a recent conversation with the elder poet. I had asked him before if he'd like to give a reading in the U.S., at Buffalo or SF, say. He replied, "Too late." "Too late for what? For us or your voice?" I laughed. I still don't have any definitive answers, but I do feel closer to the truth, like it's in the room with me, just out of sight. Mine, so long as I don't try to look at it. Maybe Ezra Pound never visited Buffalo, never authorized the publication of the poem that might as well have been his epitaph. But, as Olson, Ginsberg, and Robison sensed, maybe Buffalo is where he and it always belonged. I'll read it now, Canto 120, as it appeared, sanctioned or not, in Anonym in 1969. I have tried to write paradise. Do not move. Let the wind speak. That is paradise. Let the gods forgive what I have made. Let those I love try to forgive what I have made. Organizing Isolation is brought to you by my 13 paying subscribers. God bless them. This episode was produced by Isaac Garing with original music by Dan Ross. Special thanks go to many sources, scholars, and breadcrumb droppers, including Joe Finnerty, Joshua Coton, Robert Spoo, Roxana Preda, Nick Sturm, Peter Gizzi, Tyler Robison, Ed Sanders, Fred Waugh, Richard Seaberth, and Richard Taylor. Thanks as always to Rochelle Tormino for story consultation, soundboarding, and endless inventiveness. This one was quite a bit more involved than my other recordings. If you'd like to hear more, I'd be grateful if you'd consider chipping in.